Well, welcome to today's event. My name is Robert Weissman. I'm president of Public Citizen, and we're very glad that you've turned out for this dialogue over IMF policies, focusing especially on the issue of whether those policies, how those policies have worked in a time of economic downturn, but I think raising some other issues as well. We're going to have a nice discussion. I'm just going to offer a few opening remarks and metaphorically step aside, although I'll continue to sit here afterwards. And then Jo Marie will run the panel for us. Just want to thank you all for turning out, and the panelists, and especially James Roaf from the IMF. Hope it doesn't feel like too much of hostile territory, but we do appreciate the fund's willingness to engage in a serious dialogue over serious issues. A number of us were involved in a previous panel on the same set of topics in June, where we had some dispute, not just over policy recommendations, but over some factual questions. I think this may reemerge again. The question of exactly what has the IMF recommended in developing countries during the time of the economic crisis. So we appreciate, again, re-engaging in this conversation. There was an offer at that time to have a real sit-down to go over loans and sort of talk it through on a case-by-case basis, because some of this stuff becomes fairly technical in particular. And we're hopeful that we can proceed with that going forward after today's discussion. As a framing set of things, I wanted to raise a few questions without reviewing the record, which the panelists will do. And my job is to be critical of the IMF. It's something I've done for quite some time. It would be surprising if I changed what I was doing now. But I just want to offer them in the sort of spirit of conversation rather than as a setup for James. We just again really appreciate his joining us today. So I wanted to sort of ask a couple questions about what's going on over the last year. A couple questions about where things stand right now. And then some questions thinking forward as circumstances change. Because we're going to have an important discussion of what has happened, what has been IMF policy. But it's in circumstances that hopefully we won't be stuck with for a long-term period. And the question, even more important, is what's going to happen going forward. So in our last sort of, first just looking back, partly again from looking at the details of it, in our last conversation we had a sort of a back and forth over the issue of are IMF policies counter-cyclical at a time of economic downturn, that is, are they promoting economic expansion, particularly in the areas of government spending and monetary policy. And there's beyond looking at the detail, there's a sort of a policy question, is should there be a presumption that you'll always be counter-cyclical in times of downturn that would only be overcome by showing some specific reason that you need to do it, but the outcome would be worse if you didn't do it in some case. I think that's an important, broader policy question, part of the details of what's happened that we need to talk about. The second issue is probably the primary restraint on being counter-cyclical in a downturn, even expansionary more generally, or being more counter-cyclical or more expansionary, is current concerns about what happens to developing countries' currencies and whether there's going to be a run on the currency if they engage in expansionary policy. And there is a tool that's not often engaged to deal with that, which is capital controls. And so the second question would be, having looked at the Asian financial crisis and found the countries that imposed capital controls did better than those that didn't, where is the IMF on capital controls, and what should be the appropriate role of capital controls as a policy protection and important policy tool for developing countries? A third question, sort of thinking about, is the snapshot of where we are now. And this is a challenge for all of us. Is we've had an unexpected change in the period up to the crisis with developing countries paying off, at least outside of Africa, paying off their arrears to the fund, and sort of a real transformation of what seemed to be a perpetual debt crisis. But we're now seeing, especially in the poorest countries, the ongoing debt problem becoming much worse as a result of what's going on. And we're going to have to address this problem, a sort of unrecognized problem, not unrecognized in this room, but unrecognized in the bigger picture policy debates. We've actually, in the course of this crisis, set the stage for another chronic debt crisis in the poorest countries. And what are we going to do about that? Fourth area, and this is a broad one, it is more forward-looking. Let's presume that the global economy has returned to some kind of stability and hopefully some gentle uptick at least. That just re-raises the questions that we've been discussing before the crisis with the fund and looking at the fund policy. And particularly, is there a bias at the fund towards restrictive policies rather than expansionary policies? And will that change as there's been a new rhetorical frame at the fund? Will we see the formal and informal inflation targets loosened over time? Will we see something that would be more transformative, which would be a move away from inflation targets as a fundamental consideration or a primary one, to other targets that may have more direct social benefit, for example, unemployment targets? That's something that economic policy ought to be oriented around as a first order. Will we see exemptions from whatever restrictions that are maintained for crucial investments in healthcare, as we sort of manage to finagle in some aids specific programs, but not really in sort of core government health budgets? Will we see off-budget accounting for infrastructure investments so that countries can invest in infrastructure without being constrained by overall budget limitations? And then finally, is there, as part of the new approach that we hear about from the fund, is there a rethinking of some of the old line fund positions on financial sector liberalization, trade liberalization, privatization, and other sort of core market-oriented reforms as against an ongoing role for the state and interest in heterodox policies? Anyway, hopefully those set of questions can help frame the things we're looking at, in addition to the particular record, what happened in Guatemala on March 22nd, March 22nd, whatever it is. The particular things are going to come up, there's no question about it, but hopefully we can also have the broad conversation as well. And with that overview, Jo Marie.
Thank you. Gee, my job as a moderator just got more difficult, as in, what can I say now? I'm Jo Marie Griesgraber. I'm with New Rules for Global Finance, and I want to thank Public Citizen, CEPR, and Health Global Access Project for organizing this. And I also really want to thank the IMF for providing a speaker at the very last minute. A lot of people are away still from the annual meetings in Istanbul, so we especially thank James for coming on board. His specialty is actually in emerging markets, but he's agreed to tackle the questions related to especially low-income countries. In terms of my particular axis to grind, I probably have two main ones, well, three. One is on the evaluation of IMF projects, especially ongoing projects or immediately completed projects. Who does the evaluation, and whether it's credible at all to have IMF staff evaluating IMF staff work. I think that's a serious concern, and that was one of the issues that was raised in the fourth pillar, or the civil society global financial reform paper that was just presented in Istanbul. The second thing would be the questions about the stability. Say the IMF is doing very well right now. What about the longer-term commitment to these issues, or are they ad hominem changes linked to one managing director? Or are they foundational changes, if they are changes? You know, if we like the direction, even if we don't think it's gone far enough, or steep enough, or fast enough, is this associated with one man? And when he decides to go home to France, be president or king or prime minister, whatever they do in France, how will things look after that? I don't know what they do in France. I'm open to all options, you know? The other thing is on debt, and frankly, and I was the second shift. The previous group had already collapsed from exhaustion. So what are we going to do about sensible, systematic debt workouts for all sovereign debtors? This is long overdue. So those are some of the things that any opportunity I get, I will point to and support. Now for the order of speakers, Mark Weisbrot will go first because we are really focusing on the report that CEPR just released on 41 countries. I recommend you read the summary in the beginning and the chart. If you are real stalwart and suffer from insomnia, I strongly recommend you read all 41 individual case reviews. It's a real good read. It's well done. It's well done. It's just I have a little stamina at my age. And then he will be followed by Asia Russell, who has come down from Philadelphia to be with us today, and she's going to talk specifically about the health sector. Okay, it's received a lot of attention, a lot of international support, both bilateral aid from this country as well as from a lot of private donors. So what's the situation of health in low-income countries and how they interact with IMF recommendations? And then James Roaf will be speaking at the end, or the last panelist, and he will have some PowerPoints. So if we duck the camera because of the light, it's not a political statement on our part. Then we will go to questions. Each of the three speakers will have 15 minutes, and I will be rather ghoulish about that. So, Mark, we look forward to your comments.
Thank you.
15 minutes.
Thank you, and thanks very much for this introduction from both of you. Jo Marie, what she said about our paper was much nicer than what IMF spokesperson Bill Murray said. It's quoted in the press. He had some disparaging remarks about our research. But I'm never going to get to any of Rob's great question. I'm only going to focus on one. He's at 15 minutes, and that's the macroeconomic policy of the IMF during the current downturn. But I do want to say these are huge issues. So I think they're really important, and this is just a part of the overall picture. And with regard, I'm glad that also Rob mentioned that this comes out of discussion with the fund, and I want to continue this discussion and dialogue. I think it's very important. We had this first one in 10 or 12 years of this work that I've been doing, which was in June. And then now we're having another one, which is the follow-up. And I think we should have also that meeting that we talked about, the last one that Rob mentioned. And I think discussion and dialogue is very important because we learn from each other. I really believe that. I also think that some of the positive changes we've seen, the debt relief, for example, which is we've had under HIPC since it was enacted in 1996, that was a result of all these groups, the Jubilee movement, the debt cancellation movement, and groups like HealthCat, Action Aid, other groups around the world have really had an influence. And it helps to have this dialogue, and the IMF on their website, you can see they're committed to this dialogue with civil society. So after wasting all this time saying that, I just want to try to make this interaction as pleasant as I can, because I'm going to be criticizing the policies. Okay, now for the criticism. First, just one more thing on that. The fund did, in addition to the disparaging remarks from Bill Murray, they did actually write a 7-page critique of our work, and they gave it only to a few reporters. So I also want to encourage that be publicly released or something like it. And they put, if they don't agree with our head count of 31 out of 41 countries, then what's your count? And let's see it on the web, and then we can have that discussion continue, because there is room for disagreement. What we did was we looked at the 41 countries, all the 41 countries that currently have agreements with the IMF that are in force, and we looked at their fiscal and monetary policies in particular, and some of the other policies that Rob mentioned as well, but mainly we focused on fiscal and monetary, the two main macroeconomic policies during the current downturn. And we found that in 31 out of 41 cases during this downturn, the IMF had these countries under IMF agreements had implemented policies that we would call procyclical. That is, either pro-cyclical fiscal policy, which would mean reducing the budget deficit, cutting spending, for example, during while growth is slowing sharply or the economy is in recession. Or monetary policy, tightening monetary policy, which the fund in their agreements tended to define as a growth in the real money supply that is less than nominal GDP. I'm sorry, growth in money supply that is less than nominal GDP growth. And so,
would you please give a short definition for that?
of
Those-
what? Well, fiscal policy,
No, just the last monetary, so that's.
monetary, so if you allow if the money supply grows less than the nominal, the growth of nominal GDP, so that's GDP not adjusted for inflation. So that the fund considers tightening, and we just accepted that definition. And I have to emphasize that our definition for fiscal policy was very conservative, and I think even a lot of fund economists would probably agree, overly generous to their point of view. In other words, for example, look at the United States. Okay, we went through a deep recession. Say we didn't have any stimulus at all. The budget deficit would widen because with no stimulus policy at all, or even with the government cutting some spending, we would have a widening budget deficit because of the loss of revenues, even just the loss of revenue, enormous. Okay, and so. But in those cases, we didn't count those as pro-cyclical, which probably we should have. So I want to emphasize that. Now, let me give you just a couple of examples to show what we mean. Ukraine is expected to drop GDP growth negative 9% this year, 2009. In October 2008, they signed a standby agreement with the standby arrangement with the IMF, which called for a balanced budget. Okay, it was later relaxed to 4% of GDP. But I want to emphasize, and this, okay, is not as pro-cyclical, but probably still would be. But in any case, we're taking the first agreement, okay, in these cases, because we believe that, if you start off, if the economy is slowing sharply and hit by all these external shocks, as Ukraine was, and you have you're tightening fiscal policy, and in this case, monetary policy as well. That's bad, that hurts, even if you change it later, damage is done still. So we recognize, though, that in many cases the IMF changed their policy after some time, but nonetheless there's still damage done, and this should be avoided. And as Rob said, I agree with him completely on the one question that he phrased. My answer is yes, there should be a strong prejudice against any pro-cyclical policy in a recession. Just as we don't do it here, it shouldn't be done in other countries unless there's some overwhelming, compelling case that can be made that there would be greater harm further. Hungary, again, reduced their budget deficit in the standby arrangement called for reduced budget deficit from 2008 to 2009. Economy shrank 6.7% in 2009. These are big shrinkages. Pakistan, very slowing, severe shocks, slowing economy, fiscal tightening in their standby arrangement of October 2008. Mali. The African countries weren't as common to have this because, for a variety of reasons. And it doesn't look as bad on paper because, these countries didn't go into negative growth, most of them. Mali did, actually, and their agreement called for a reduction of the deficit from 1.9 to 0.7% of GDP. Gabon, Mali didn't, they had slowing growth. Gabon had negative growth, and they had a deficit reduction also in their agreement. So there's, again, you can look at all the 31. We wrote a little page or two on each one. Can't go through them all here. I want to just make it clear that, again, we can have a dialogue with the fund, and they might have a different definition in some cases. And I would be surprised if they can't find something that we're wrong about. I mean, after all, they have about 100 times as many economists and about 600 times our operating budget. So they should be able to do a better job on this than us. But I would like to see that job and see how much it differs from what we found. Again, using fairly generous and conservative definitions for pro-cyclical policies. Now, let me go through some of the responses that you typically see, and I would anticipate. One is, the IMF didn't know the slowdown was going to be this bad, and So therefore, they were making policy on the basis of projections that underestimated the negative growth or slowdown in growth. This is true. However, I still think they have to be held accountable for that. And you know, this is one of the examples, by the way, where the IMF has learned from us, I think. Dominique Strauss-Kahn said recently that central banks should look at asset bubbles when they monitor the economy, which they haven't done. Bernanke hasn't said that yet. I give the IMF credit for saying that. I mean, they're ahead of the central banks on this one. That's what we've been arguing for 10 years. In fact, since my colleague Dean Baker was the first to actually analyze both the stock market bubble and the housing bubble, first in the late 90s stock market and the housing bubble in 2002. But this research was available, and so, you know, certainly by 2008, the agreements I mentioned, this was the economy was crashing, the world economy was crashing. We knew there was going to be hundreds of billions of dollars in lost capital flows because there was even in the 2001 mild recession. We knew this was going to be a really bad recession. We tracked it at CEPR, we tracked the size of the housing bubble, so this was an $8 trillion housing bubble which peaked in 2006, it broke in 2007. We had our first stimulus package here in the United States even in February 2007. So it was inadequate, but nonetheless there was an awareness that something terrible was going on, and different economists, you know, Rubini wrote about the financial aspects of it. But all this was available, so I mean, I'm willing to say, you know, okay, they made a mistake, but nonetheless, I don't think that's an out for having pro-cyclical policies or underestimate. They should have known, it was clear, these were late enough in the game. Second, I think, you know, the fund will say, and they often do, that they're not the ones that made the decision. And Latvia is the perfect case. You know, here's a fund agreement where, you know, the economy dropped 18% according to fund projections this year. This is, by definition, a failure. There's no adjustment that should lose 18% of GDP. This is, you know, not very common in economic history, drops of declines of this magnitude. And here, again, it was accompanied by pro-cyclical policies. Now, well, this was done in order to maintain an overvalued fixed exchange rate, very similar to the policies that the fund supported in Argentina from 1998 to 2002. The fund will say, well, you know, we didn't really like this either, but we went along because the government wanted to do it, the European Union wanted to do it. Okay, fine. But the point is, I don't think the fund can escape its responsibility for this too. They don't sign off on agreements that they, and policies they don't agree with. You know, if Russia wants to nationalize and renationalize its industries that come to a fund for a loan, they're not going to get that loan. Okay, and Venezuela is not going to get a loan for its policies either. And you know. And so they still signed off on it. And the third one, I think, there's a couple more arguments, but I think, you know, there's a very strong double standard here. As I said, you know, the fund is, and I give them credit for it. And by the way, I give them credit also for the expansion of the SDRs. That was a very good policy because that was unconditional, right? The $283 billion of money being available to the world. Most of it, unfortunately, to the rich countries, not going to borrow it, but still significant amounts to the developing countries. Okay, you know, they are saying that countries should pursue stimulus policies, but it's mainly the rich countries. Now, obviously, it's easier for the rich countries to pursue stimulus policies, especially the United States. You know, the whole world will take our dollars, run huge deficits, much easier. But the point is, the point of the IMF funding should be to provide the foreign exchange reserves to the borrowing countries so that they too can pursue counter-cyclical policies as much as is feasible. And if some of these countries are running deficits or, you know, either budget deficit, fiscal deficits, or current account deficits that are you know, unsustainable in the long run, well, the time to adjust, it's the same as for us, right? We're going to do the adjustment later. We'll do the adjustment a few years from now when the economy is recovered. You don't do the adjustment when the economy is going down. So I think that's you know, that's a very important idea. That you know, if they have to adjust, they really should be doing it. They should be doing it later. Now, the other thing that I think is really important is the whole question of accountability and formulating macroeconomic policy. I mean, this isn't the first time that this has happened.
right? I mean, I think the fund has acknowledged in its internal evaluations, and even in their evaluation of this crisis, for example, in the latest paper they had on the lending in crisis countries, the fund said, they didn't say it as a criticism, but they did say that in many countries, automatic stabilizers, that is the automatic stabilizers that kick in when you go into recession. In the United States, for example, spending on unemployment compensation, food stamps, those things increase automatically. That in program countries, in fund program countries, they were not allowed to, the automatic stabilizers weren't allowed to go to their full amount. So this is clearly a pro-cyclical, or I would call it a pro-cyclical policy as well, even though we didn't count it in our, we wouldn't necessarily count that in our tally, because it could be the budget deficit is increasing in that case. But so you have this review, you have previous reviews, the Asian crisis, you know, where there have been mistakes, but you don't see an attempt to reevaluate, to look at how the fund is formulating its macroeconomic policy. Why is this necessary? Is it just because the fund wants to be paid back? And okay, they have a legitimate interest in that. They can't be throwing tens of billions of dollars at Latvia or Iceland, for example, if it's, you know, going to go down the tubes and never get paid back. But then that should be shown. They should have to justify when they do something that actually makes an economy worse, when people are losing jobs and the government is cutting spending, and especially in the poorer countries where, you know, healthcare spending is going to be a matter of life and death, and so on. So I'll end it right there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Thank you. And I'm sure the IMF is going to be eager to share with us the 13 pages or 30 pages or however long the critique was. And this is something that we'll definitely read, and maybe you'll entice us to read other things on your website.
It's not public yet.
Oh, I'm sure they're going to make it public.
Okay.
I'm sure.
I hope so.
Right? I see lots of nods, so ask and you'll receive, see? Aren't they nice? Okay, now I also wanted just to note for the record that this whole presentation is being videotaped and audio taped, so when it comes time for your questions, we do want you to rise, look your best, smile at the camera,
I'm swearing.
and say, you know, your name and organization, okay? But just so you know that this is on the record. With that, I'd like to introduce Asia Russell. Why can't I say Russell?
A lot of people do that. Asia Russia is often.
And thanks for making the trip down from Philadelphia. And you get 15 minutes, Asia.
First, just want to add my thanks to CEPR for performing this very important research, and to Public Citizen for hosting us, and to the IMF for joining us in what is hopefully a very fruitful and dynamic dialogue. I come from a group called Health Gap. It's an advocacy and policy organization that focuses on overcoming barriers to access to life-saving HIV treatment, care, and prevention. We also work with an IMF working group of NGOs in Washington, D.C. It's a diverse coalition of civil society organizations working on health, development, and trade justice. And we actually came together several years ago. Our work has really been animated by a desire to come up with policy reforms that could hopefully correct what we see as overly austere and restrictive policies supported by the IMF and implemented by countries, in particular in order to promote scaled-up investment in health, education, and other essential public goods. This is, as we all agree, a priority issue, not just for low-income countries, but for middle-income countries as well. And it was quite interesting in late 2008, a lot of our focus and energy was going into work around the IMF's efforts then to sell some of its gold reserves in order to deal with, at the time, severely diminished relevance, a shrinkage in their own staff, and a real crisis in terms of its role in the global economy. And that, of course, changed very rapidly with the onset of the global economic crisis, so that in a matter of just a short period of time, the G20 committed to invest some $750 billion in new funding for the IMF, with $108 billion coming, as we know, from an appropriation from the US government. So we found ourselves as a working group of civil society organizations with the ground shifting quite a lot under our feet. And an effort which I know was talked about in the previous panel with the IMF, an effort by civil society to try to take advantage of this opportunity, to try to examine this massive influx of new resources for the IMF in order to increase investments flowing out to countries suffering from the economic crisis, and really attach some conditions to these new resources, conditions that would ensure that resources could actually be used to scale up stimulus packages, to implement comprehensive social protection schemes, including prioritization of the needs of the most vulnerable, health, education, investments in some of the measures that would really ensure that people at risk of sickness and death would not be made further vulnerable by the economic crisis. And that's why the results of CEPR's research are actually so critical. It shows us, in a way, how important the focus of our effort as a working group was. Unfortunately, as people probably know, the effort was valiant but largely unsuccessful. That is, the appropriation occurred, and certainly a lot of decision makers in Washington had their horizons expanded about how valuable it would have been to attach some of these important evidence-based conditions on this massive appropriation. But nevertheless, the appropriation was made, and now resources are beginning to flow to countries, and lo and behold, our concerns, unfortunately, have been validated, it seems like. While, as I'm sure the IMF representative will mention, it seems like in a minority of countries, there is some appetite or willingness for temporary relaxation of some restrictions. In the majority of countries, we are seeing these pro-cyclical policies in a time of devastating economic contraction. And I want to highlight for a second the health dimension of this economic crisis. I think we talk a lot in sort of an academic way about social protection, about some of the impacts on low-income and middle-income countries, but unfortunately, it's becoming increasingly clear that the economic crisis, without concerted action on the parts of developed and developing countries, will have devastating impacts on our efforts to scale up to reach agreed international commitments like the Millennium Development Goals, like universal access to HIV treatment and care. As folks probably know, the economic crisis is going to catapult another 49 million people around the world into poverty. Interestingly, fragile but really important gains were being made in some efforts to scale up prevention, treatment, and care for primary health priorities in developing countries. There have been, for example, limited reductions in child mortality in some countries. Now, approximately 30 to 40%, depending on how you count it, of people in urgent clinical need of access to HIV treatment and care have access. In part, that's been possible because of something that Rob mentioned briefly, and that's, however ad hoc, a sort of a willingness in some countries to relax some fiscal and monetary restrictions, policy restrictions in countries in order to expand investments in the health sector. But unfortunately, that's been really the exception rather than the rule. In the case of US bilateral funding, since so much of those investments come off budget, that's also to a certain extent been possible. We can return to that in a second. So these fragile gains in some areas have been made. In areas like maternal mortality, it's been quite scandalous that we actually haven't been able to make very much progress. In fact, in some sub-Saharan African countries, some of the same countries that CEPR has evaluated, in fact, maternal mortality indicators have gotten worse over the last several years. So the response to the crisis will have really life and death implications for countless people around the world. The World Health Organization estimates that average GDP growth rate of developing countries is now projected to fall in 2009 to less than half the pre-crisis rate. And they calculate this in terms of preventable, avoidable deaths of children. Concretely, their preliminary analysis, and this is already a few months old, shows that infant deaths in developing countries may be on average 200,000 to 400,000 per year higher in 2009, and that the MDG target year of 2015, between 2009 and 2015, compared with projections in the absence of the economic crisis. So if you add that up, unless the crisis is reversed, corresponds to a total of 1.4 to 2.8 million excess infant deaths during this period, between now and the period at which the international community is supposed to reach Millennium Development Goals, 2015. Importantly, in low-income countries already, key policymakers are reporting that they expect that the recession will undermine their success in responding to the HIV crisis. This is according to UNAIDS and to World Bank, an initial World Bank research reported in mid-2009. So it's critical. We've experienced a period over the last several years where health aid, both in terms of domestic investments and in terms of international and bilateral investments, has actually increased, not at a pace that's needed in order to reach these shared global goals, but has gained some ground. And our response to the economic crisis will really be quite defining in terms of whether we go tremendously off track, or whether we're able to continue not just in maintaining or in sort of running in place, but in actually getting on track to expand investments. And I think a critical and unexamined or underexamined link in the midst of these debates is the role that the IMF is playing right now and will play as we hopefully turn the tide and experience an uptick in growth. So we are, many of the countries examined in CEPR's report, Mozambique, El Salvador, Haiti, Gabon, Mali, these are countries where responding to health priorities is of critical importance to the government, to civil society, and as I mentioned before, it's astounding that in a time of economic recession, pro-cyclical policies have been associated with IMF lending and other instruments. So it's incredibly important to think what will happen when the crisis hopefully subsides. Because this discussion about the way in which lending takes place in a time of financial crisis should in no way detract from a question Rob mentioned earlier, which is to what extent fiscal austerity in monetary policy is ever appropriate in countries that are facing these tremendous health challenges and tremendous needs. As I mentioned before, a lot of our work as a civil society coalition was animated by data showing that the IMF's lending practices, even in a time of relative economic growth, that is before the crisis, was associated with a lack of or an underinvestment or a slowing of growth in investments in the health and education sector, which was extremely troubling. For example, as people probably know, according to analysis done by a think tank here in Washington, D.C., the Center for Global Development, in 2007, their research showed that in many cases, the evidence suggested that the IMF supports fiscal programs that have been too conservative or too risk-averse. And that in particular, I'm quoting, the IMF has not done enough to explore more expansionary but still feasible options for higher public spending in the area of health, as well as education and other essential priorities. On the issue of IMF monetary policy supported in developing countries, this research found that empirical evidence doesn't justify pushing inflation to the low levels that were revealed by research in low-income countries. So I want to emphasize here, we'll get to a point where hopefully this global recession will be a thing of the past. And I think it's important for us to talk together now about what will befall countries then, to the extent that there's an opening or a willingness to explore more the value and importance of more expansionary fiscal and monetary policies in a time of contraction, what is appropriate for low-income and middle-income countries in a time of economic growth. We would argue that it's incredibly important to interrogate these concepts of macroeconomic stability, of what the appropriate level of inflation targeting is for a country when we're looking at countries that are not on track to meet their Millennium Development Goal targets, when we're looking at countries where ministries of health and ministries of education are desperate to expand their investments because they see the impact that that has on their people. And yet, at the end of the day, because these decisions are being made behind closed doors, shutting out not just civil society, but also ministries of health, education, gender, who have expertise and who have a stake in calculating what the appropriate trade-off should be, too often those experts are shut out of these negotiations, are shut out of these discussions, and their expertise is not brought to bear in these debates. So I think I want to close by highlighting what we want to see moving forward, not only in terms of this very important dialogue, but also in terms of reform. The G20 in Pittsburgh and the IMF annual meetings and bank meetings in Istanbul have reaffirmed this important role for the IMF in responding to the global economic crisis. I think many in civil society challenged the notion that the IMF should have that central role, but given we're in a period of dynamism in sort of thinking about the right roles for the IMF currently, let's take advantage of that and think creatively about what we want to see and what we don't want to see. And I think a few important points come to mind, building on this theme that Mark mentioned around accountability. What can we do in order to ensure that multiple actors, both at the country level and here in Washington, D.C., are actually engaging directly and in a consequential way in determining what trade-offs are set at country level? Here, there's a critical role for civil society to play, for multiple economic experts to play, again, in a direct way before consequential decisions are made, not after the fact. I think it's also critical to examine the new resources being made available to countries. As was mentioned earlier, many of these resources will unfortunately be debt creating. They won't be condition free, and they won't. And we are very concerned that we are on the verge of creating a new debt crisis for low-income and middle-income countries. This is precisely the kind of situation we want to be avoiding. We need to fundamentally learn lessons from the mistakes of the past, not repeat them. And I think I'll just stop there and look forward to continuing this dialogue, and hope that there are more opportunities in the future for these kinds of important discussions, hopefully before DSK returns to France to become king or leader. So
Whatever they are.
yeah, whatever they are. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Asia. So we've had the overview of the macroeconomic policies, and then looked at one of the sectors, the implications in that sector. And with that, we're going to invite James to speak. Dr. Roaf, thank you again for coming, pedaling his bicycle through the rain, a champion of dialogue with civil society. If you like, you have 15 minutes, and I understand you're going to read the PowerPoint, so we need to turn around.
Okay, well, thanks very much. The first thing I wanted to say was to you sounded as if I would be reluctant to come, but you know we're very interested to have these debates and to have this discussion. So I'm very happy to be invited here to discuss this. I'm the Deputy Division Chief in Emerging Markets Division of the Strategy Policy Development Review Department of the Fund. So I'm going to speak particularly about the emerging markets side. Mark was kind enough to mention a paper that we've actually written ourselves, has just come out just before the annual meetings, on the emerging market programs that we've just had. In fact, there's two papers that have just come out, because we've also done, my colleagues in the low-income part of the same department have written a paper on the experience of the low-income programs. So there's two papers, and I think there's copies of them all outside, which I'd really encourage you to pick up if you can get a copy, because they really look at exactly these same issues that the CEPR paper is looking at. So I'm going to speak mainly about the emerging market cases and try to explain why I find this debate almost a little surreal, because in our discussions we're looking at the policies as being very accommodative and not pro-cyclical in general. And I'm going to explain to you why I think that is. So this is a rather long slide, but this is about the review that we've done on the emerging market cases. Now we've had about 15 cases of emerging market programs that have come along since the crisis, a huge expansion of work that we've been doing in the emerging markets, and we've looked at these from the same kind of perspective, looking at what has happened, what have the policies been in 2009, and how have they been turning out. These programs are actually quite across the board. A lot of them are concentrated in Eastern Europe and the former CES countries, Central Eastern Europe and former CIS countries, but there's also Pakistan, 3 cases in Central America, Mongolia, so there's a range of new emerging market programs. And what we find, contrary to what Mark's study is showing, is that we've seen an accommodative fiscal stance in the programs. In fact, in 14 or 15 of them, the fiscal deficits have expanded. And we've also looked at the size of the expansion. We've not just looked at whether it's going up or down, but how the scale is of the expansion. So I'll come on to that. Social protection has been a key feature of all of these programs. In almost all of them, there's been increased social spending. More focused structural conditionality. This has often been an issue with civil society about the structural elements of the programs, that they're too far-reaching and too onerous. I think that's something the fund itself has acknowledged and looked at, and we've tried to address. And I think this review has been looking at that to see if that actually turned out to be the case. In looking at them, we've compared these programs to how some of the past cases, we've seen some very significant differences with past cases. Exchange rate and interest rate overshooting has been almost non-existent, much less compared to the very large collapses in exchange rates we saw before. Less wrenching current account adjustment. That's partly because the IMF is providing more financing, more flexible, more front-loaded financing, along with other donors, other official lenders, and so less domestic demand compression in the countries, and particularly fewer banking crises. I mean, there's one big exception, of course, which is Iceland, which really is a banking crisis. You know, that's where it's all coming from. But you know, very often in past crisis cases, we've seen huge banking crises making things much worse in the programs, and that really has hardly happened in these cases, which is really quite I think a very notable fact, given that this is a global financial crisis that started with the advanced country banks. A lot of these countries have a lot of exposure of foreign banks, and there was a lot of fear a year ago that these bank exposures were going to feed through into particularly Central and Eastern Europe and really cause major banking problems there. And that's mainly been avoided under these programs. And the other important point that we found in our studies is we're comparing the program countries with other emerging market countries that have been hit by the crisis, and we see actually very little difference between what either the policies or the outcomes in the program countries compared to the non-program countries. And I think this speaks to the point about ownership, which is also relevant to conditionality. I think there's been a lot of attention to ensuring that these are countries' programs. They're IMF-supported programs, but they really are the programs of the country. Mark mentioned that already in one case, the question of where do you draw the line between ownership and on Latvia, and we can discuss that. But in general, countries are pursuing, it seems, the same kind of policies under the fund programs that the countries that do not have programs are pursuing, and I think that's quite an important point. Now, if I run through the low-income country paper, here this is looking at a set of low-income countries that have had programs throughout the food and fuel crisis in 2007, 2008 to now. It's a longer scope of paper than our emerging market ones. And again, you can see counter-cyclical fiscal policy is an important element of this. 3/4 of the countries covered have rising fiscal deficits as revenues decline. 2/3 see increased budget spending within that, and 19 programs, and 16 of 19 programs have envisaged higher social spending. So then there's also some food and fuel, which I'm not going to go into now. So I imagine at this point the audience is somewhat confused because you've just heard one side about how all the IMF programs are strongly pro-cyclical, and now you're hearing from me that they're all counter-cyclical. And what I'll try to do is try to explain, at least as I understand it, how to reconcile these two approaches or two views of the same set of programs and the same set of data. And here's a table. We can't read all this, but this is from Mark's paper with the fiscal policy settings. Fiscal policy. In his paper, he shows a dot for a contractionary fiscal policy, and you can see that I think it's 22 out of 33 or something like this, or 23 out of 33 are showing up as a contractionary pro-cyclical fiscal policy in 2009. The key issue here is what you're measuring. And this is the initial, as Mark said, this is the initial program setting when the program was first started. And of course, at that time, in many of these cases, we didn't expect, indeed he said, we did not expect such a large downturn in activity. And so when we look at what has actually happened after where we are now, with the latest data are both on looking at the downturn that's happened and the revisions that have been made to the program, you can see that for the same year, this is exactly the same measure. What is the fiscal deficit in 2009 compared to the fiscal deficit in 2008? And you can see that there's only, I put them all in here, we've only got 7 cases out of 41 in which there's actually been a tightening of fiscal policy, in fact. Right? So I think the key word here is what's been implemented. And Mark said that the programs have implemented a tighter fiscal policy, but that's not the case. What's happened is that they've implemented a looser fiscal policy. There were initially plans in many cases to have a tighter one. We don't actually agree with all of the cases that you've got there. Some of the ones I looked at, we would not have had a red dot looking at the tables. But as I say, I don't think that's important. The important thing is what's actually been implemented and what is being implemented in these programs, and that's why we are saying that these have counter-cyclical expansionary policies in them. Now, Mark was saying, yes, all right, but it's the initial programs that matter. Now, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that either, and that's because the fund was very quick to adapt to the worsening conditions, and as fiscal deficits outcomes have got worse, revenues have fallen, the programs have adapted to allow it. And I don't think there's been any actual damage done to the countries. And I'll explain why the initial settings have not caused any damage, and why the important thing is to look at what the actual fiscal deficits are. If we look here, this is exactly this point about how we've expanded deficits. This is our expectation of where the deficits were going to be back in October 2008 is the top of the bar. And you can see that we were expecting, across these programs, rather small deficits. And then where we are now, a year later, we're expecting very large deficits in a lot of these countries. And that's because revenues have completely collapsed in many cases. I mean, you can see that Iceland and Latvia are extreme cases here where we have deficits now expected to be extremely large by any standard, right? Ukraine was one which was accused of being counter-cyclical. We're expecting, where Mark quoted a number of percent, I think, we're expecting now a deficit of 8.6% in the program. I mean, it may even get bigger. It's a very large deficit and a very expansionary program from that point of view. Hungary was another one you mentioned. Here, there's been much less of an expansion. There's somewhat less of a GDP decline in Hungary, but there's also an explanation for why the deficit is not getting as big. Is that Hungary started with a very severe fiscal problem in the first place and has much less room than Ukraine to expand. Ukraine started with a very low public debt and has a lot more room to expand their deficit in 2009. Hungary had a large deficit already and much less room to expand. You can see the program average has got large expenses. This is reflected in the programs. This is speaking exactly to the initial programs and later programs point that these green dots are the initial program levels and the bars are the latest program review levels of the deficit. So you can see how these have been, as we review the programs, we've adjusted these targets, and we will continue to do so. Some of them, haven't had a review for a while. Armenia, I'm sure, will see a much bigger target once we come to the next review. Now, did the initial projections make any difference? We haven't. I don't know how to look at this, without the counterfactual there, but one thing we did look at in our program. Let me go forward to this. Whoops. Here we are. One thing we did look at in our paper was trying to understand whether the programs were associated with worse outcomes, which is another thing Mark accused them of making things worse in the countries. Here you can see this is a regression of very simple regression of GDP growth in 2009, how big the output collapse was in 2009, based on a number of pre-existing conditions in the country, initial conditions in the country to do with current account deficits, fiscal deficits, external debt, public debt, and reserves. These are all variables as of 2007. How did these countries go into the recession? Which were the factors that caused countries to be vulnerable in this crisis and caused them to have a large output collapse? And I think what you can see clearly here is that the program countries and the non-program countries, the other emerging markets that didn't come to the fund for programs, are actually pretty much spread out around the place along the same kind of relationship here. And we look at this statistically, and there is no statistical significant difference between the two. So I think based on this, it's very hard to say that the programs are making anything worse in any of these countries. What is causing the problem in the country is the difficult vulnerabilities that they were in to begin with. Large current account deficits, something that the IMF and others, of course, were warning about before. Large, high public debt, high fiscal deficits, sort of economic problems going into the crisis that's caused the output collapse. So, based on this, I would draw the further inference that any difference between the initial program settings and the final program settings are not causing any worse outcomes in these countries. If I can just go back, so what I think what we are accused of, the only thing this paper is accusing us of is of getting it wrong on the forecast, and we did get it wrong. I mean, along with everybody else, this shows the fund forecasts of 2009, sort of a different vintages of forecast, and you can see that we were expecting, along with everybody else, which is the consensus forecast elsewhere, we were expecting things to be better than they turned out, and I think it's. Personally, I've done a lot of forecasting in my life, and I'm never expect to do well at it, and I don't think you expect anybody to do well at it. You'll find some people like Rabini did do well, but for everyone who did as well, there's somebody on the other side of this average, right? And we are trying to improve, and we will have taken a lot of lessons, I think, from this crisis, along with everybody else. But I think the key issue is not to expect too much from the forecast, that we know that we're not going to be accurate, and And we know that we have to be able to adapt, and that's what we've done in this crisis. We've adapted quickly as these conditions have got worse. There's a suggestion in the paper that we were more rosy on the program countries than on the other countries. I don't think I think from this you don't really see that. We seem to be along the consensus in either case. Let me just come to monetary policy. Now, monetary policy is very difficult to measure exactly what's happening with monetary policy, but I think this chart shows some of the story here. This is the medians, the lines, and the ranges within this is the 75th percentile to the 25th percentile of these programs that we're looking at. And you can see that interest rates, some interest rates did need to rise in the crisis, and that's a normal response of emerging market countries to stabilize the situation. You need some, but it's been extremely modest. Compared to what happened in past crises, you can see that there's really not been a major ratcheting of interest rates in these programs. I mean, these past cases, there was a lot of controversy about the level of interest rates that were involved in the Asia crisis, for example. And I'm not going to get into that discussion, but this hasn't really happened here, and that's of course related in a kind of circular way with the fact that exchange rates have not collapsed. So I think there is some. I would say there's been some modest increase in interest rates and then a decline in interest rates. When we look at the LICs, we see that real money growth has been positive in pretty much all the programs. So this is just repeating that point, I guess, that we see a very different policy mix, a more accommodative policy mix in monetary and fiscal policy together in this case than in the past cases. And altogether, we're moving towards this corner, which is more accommodative. This is the point about the currency overshooting, and I won't dwell on that. I'm being encouraged to speed up. Conditionality, this has been a common bugbear, as I mentioned, and we can see that conditionality, this is again from our emerging markets review, the conditionality has seemed to both become reduced in the number of conditions that we're imposing in the programs, say imposing that we are agreeing with our country, with the countries, and more focused. Financial sector has been a particular issue here. We were very aware of the dangers in the financial sector, and therefore you can see that financial sector has become a bigger share of the policies. In the LICs, it's the same story. In the low-income countries, there's been about a third, reduction by about a third in the number of conditions, and here the focus is very much on public financial management. That's I think, a well-recognized issue in the low-income countries, and there's I think even predominantly these are